Hello everyone, and welcome to the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict academic webinar series. My name is Jake Fitzpatrick, and I am the Content Development Associate at ICNC. And today's webinar is titled, Why Nonviolent Revolutions Sometimes Fail: Insights and Strategic Lessons from Civil Resistance Struggles in China, Panama, and Kenya from 1985 to 1992. And it will be delivered by Dr. Sharon Erickson Nepstad, Professor of Sociology at the University of New Mexico and the author of Nonviolent Revolutions. Sharon Erickson Nepstad is Professor of Sociology at the University of New Mexico. She received her PhD from the University of Colorado and did postdoctoral studies at Princeton University. She has been a visiting scholar at Notre Dame University's Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies. Her areas of interest are in social movements, civil resistance, and religion. She's the author of numerous articles and 3 books: Nonviolent Revolutions, Civil Resistance in the Late 20th Century, published in 2011 by Oxford University Press; Religion and War Resistance in the Plowshares Movement, published in 2008 by Cambridge University Press; and Convictions of the Soul, Religion, Culture, and Agency in the Central America Solidarity Movement, published in 2004 by Oxford University Press. Her book on the Plowshares Movement won the 2009 Outstanding Book Award from the American Sociological Association's section on peace, war, and social conflict. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to Dr. Nepstad.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you this afternoon and have the opportunity to talk about my research, and particularly about this topic of why nonviolent revolutions sometimes fail. We know that in the struggle for Indian independence, Gandhi proved to the world how effective civil resistance can be. And since then, we've seen over and over how nonviolent methods have enabled citizens to oust authoritarian regimes. However, since many people are still skeptical about the power of civil resistance, much of our research has been about documenting successful cases to provide evidence that this method actually works and to demonstrate how it works. Yet by focusing primarily on successful cases, we miss an opportunity to learn from those cases that did not achieve their goals. I maintain that it's important to study failed movements for the following reasons. First, it enables us to gain insights into the types of internal movement challenges that can derail a struggle. Secondly, it gives us a chance to learn more about the types of counter-strategies that regimes use to retain power. And third, we can use these insights to help civil resistors anticipate and address these potential problems. Therefore, in today's webinar, I'll focus on 3 civil resistance movements that failed to usher in regime change. These include the Tiananmen Square democracy struggle in China in 1989, Panama's movement to oust General Manuel Noriega, and the Kenyan struggle against President Daniel Arap Moi. The strategy of civil resistance is based on the ideas of Henry David Thoreau and Mohandas Gandhi, who argued that no regime can function without the support of its citizens. And to understand this theory, it really entails a shift in the way that we view political power. Many people view political power as concentrated solely in the ruling elite. Citizens, therefore, must trust that rulers take their interests into consideration as they legislate policies and govern the nation. But if rulers become self-interested, corrupt, or oppressive, then there are few options for change. In democratic contexts, the population can vote in new leaders. Yet in authoritarian settings where legitimate elections are not held or institutional mechanisms for change do not exist, then people must either acquiesce or use violent measures to destroy the system. In other words, this traditional view holds that the only type of power that citizens have in authoritarian settings is the power of violence. In direct contrast, nonviolent resistors operate from an alternative perspective, one which holds that rulers' power is derived from citizens' support and consent. Political theorist Gene Sharp argues that citizens possess multiple types of power that they either can grant to rulers or withhold from them. And if the population withholds its power in cooperation, violent attacks on the state are not necessary, or rulers simply rendered powerless and the regime collapses. So what are these types of power that citizens possess? First of all, citizens can refuse to acknowledge rulers as legitimate. Secondly, they can refuse to cooperate with the state or obey laws. Third, they can refuse to use their skills to promote government activities. People typically do this through a general strike where they disrupt business as usual and interrupt state operations. Fourth, they can contest ideologies or mentalities of obedience. Fifth, citizens also control part of the regime's material resources, which constitutes another source of power. When people refuse to pay taxes or buy government services, they deplete a ruler's coffers. Sixth, rulers often punish those who challenge their authority. Yet rulers themselves don't carry out these punishments. They rely on their security forces to do so. Yet police officers and soldiers can decide whether they want to remain loyal to the regime or side with the opposition movement. And if security officers refuse to carry out orders, or if they defect, a ruler loses the capacity to sanction. Since citizens largely control these six forms of power, a ruler's position is always precarious since it's dependent upon the people's consent. As Sharp states, when people refuse their cooperation, withhold help, and persist in their disobedience and defiance, they're denying their opponent the basic human assistance and cooperation that any government or hierarchical system requires. Subjects may disobey laws they reject. Workers may halt work, which paralyzes the economy. The bureaucracy may refuse to carry out instruction. Soldiers and police may become lax in inflicting repression. They may even mutiny. And if people and institutions do this in sufficient numbers for long enough, that government or hierarchical system will no longer have power. Its power has dissolved. Now, civil resistors in many countries have effectively used this strategy to overturn authoritarian regimes. But there are a couple issues that are not sufficiently addressed in Sharp's model. First of all, Sharp's model assumes that a ruler's power is totally derived from the cooperation of the ruled. And critics have noted that rulers can also gain power, notably from international sources, such as foreign nations or the global economic system. Secondly, this model hasn't sufficiently addressed the counter-strategies of regime rulers. Just like a chess game, a political struggle is not won or lost by the skill of one side, but rather both sides. In this presentation, then, I'll offer a very brief overview of civil resistance struggles in China, Panama, and Kenya. And then I'm going to analyze the types of internal movement challenges that resistors faced, as well as the counter-strategies that regimes used. So let me begin by discussing the Chinese democracy movement in 1989. The movement actually began in the spring of 1988 when many Beijing students began holding discussions about democracy, China's growing economic problems and corruption, and political repression. The students began planning protest events, but they found the right opportunity to act in April of 1989 when the Chinese Communist Party's former Secretary General died unexpectedly. Since funerals were the one occasion when people were allowed to publicly assemble, students seized the opportunity to stage a sit-in in Tiananmen Square, where the government's executive and legislative branches are located. When tens of thousands of people turned out for the Tiananmen Square protests, the students quickly formed the Beijing Provisional Federation of Autonomous Students, and this became the coordinating body of the emerging movement. The movement's first act was a student boycott of classes. And now, in response to the boycott, the Chinese Communist Party printed an editorial in the daily newspaper trying to discredit the students as traitors and troublemakers. This outraged the students, who then decided to organize further marches. And these marches mobilized hundreds of thousands. Yet the students, after a while, realized that the state was not making any concessions and they hadn't seen any concrete gains. So by mid-May, they decided to launch a new tactic, the hunger strikes. Hunger strikes evoked an even stronger response from Chinese citizens. Roughly 1 million supporters came to Tiananmen Square. And while this tactic was clearly effective in garnering public support, it revealed a division within the movement leadership. Some of the student leaders wanted to stop the hunger strikes and begin negotiations with the state, but another group of students wanted to escalate the level of militancy. Now, one of the final tactics that the civil resistors used was trying to win the solidarity of the People's Liberation Army. When the movement began, 20,000 troops moved into the Beijing area, and students were really hopeful that they could win them over, especially since many soldiers had friends and family within the movement. The resistors began appealing to the troops, imploring them to protect the people, not the state. The appeals were initially effective, as some police officers and soldiers actually marched with the students, and others refused to take any forceful action against them. But the troops' sympathy was also evident on May 20th, 1989, when the regime declared martial law. Troops were ordered to advance towards Tiananmen Square. Citizens, however, quickly erected barricades and they physically surrounded the tanks, and after a couple of days, the tanks were forced to retreat. This gave civil resistors a temporary victory, but it became clear that the movement's momentum was being undermined by growing internal conflicts. Specifically, there were tensions between Beijing students who wanted to negotiate and those who wanted more confrontational action. But there were also tensions between Beijing students and students from outside provinces who had come to join the movement. There were also tensions between students and workers, many of whom had come to join the Tiananmen Square occupation. Student resistors considered themselves the vanguard of the movement and did not always welcome the workers' participation. And as a result of all these divisions, civil resistors were unable to agree on a common course of action, and thus the movement stalled. Now, in addition to their internal conflicts, the movement soon faced another problem, a military crackdown. In early June of 1989, the military entered Beijing, and once again citizens came out to block the tanks. This time, however, the emotional tone had changed as people vented their anger, and they no longer maintained a nonviolent discipline. Local residents threw rocks and tossed Molotov cocktails, and this time, when troops were ordered to use violence to clear the path to Tiananmen Square, they obeyed those orders, killing thousands in the process. When the troops finally reached the square in the early morning hours of June 4th, they ordered the protesters to evacuate or face the consequences. Protesters took a vote on whether they should stay or leave, and those wishing to evacuate won the vote. Within 25 minutes, the civil resistors left. The occupation of Tiananmen Square was over, and so too was the movement. Our second case is Panama's National Civic Crusade. Now, General Manuel Noriega seized power in Panama in 1984, but he was from the beginning pretty widely despised by Panama's citizens due to his involvement in drug trafficking, money laundering, and weapons dealings. Yet organized resistance to his rule didn't emerge until the summer of 1987, when Noriega, fearing a military coup, forced his military chief of staff into retirement. The military chief sought revenge, and on the radio he accused Noriega of electoral fraud and killing his predecessor by planting a bomb on his plane. These accusations generated public outrage, and the next day numerous politicians walked out of the Legislative Assembly and thousands demonstrated. In response, Noriega sent out riot police to disperse the crowds. However, this didn't deter the protesters, and the demonstrations continued. These demonstrations gave Chamber of Commerce President hope that Panama citizens could overthrow Noriega through nonviolent means. To achieve this, he formed the National Civic Crusade and promptly called for a campaign of civil disobedience. Quickly, hundreds of professional, business, church, union, and civic groups joined the National Civic Crusade. Within days of the movement's formation, Panamanians started expressing their resistance to Noriega by banging on pots and honking horns each day at noon and 6 p.m. Spontaneously, many also began waving white handkerchiefs. Next, the National Civic Crusade organized a demonstration, and in July of 1987, more than 100,000 people, all dressed in the movement's chosen color of white, filled Panama City streets. Along the marching routes, people hung white towels and bedsheets from their windowsills to express their support. The movement's next move was a general strike, and when Panamanians didn't report to work, commercial activity stopped and banks remained locked. The bank closures had a very serious impact on the economy. As news of the country's political turmoil was reported, foreign investors withdrew an estimated $3 to $4 billion from Panama in just a few days. The regime's financial situation was further decimated when local business leaders began a fiscal disobedience campaign refusing to pay taxes. In response to the movement, Noriega declared a state of emergency. He suspended constitutional guarantees, he censored newspapers, and he ordered troops to occupy the capital. But the movement was not intimidated, and it went ahead with its strikes and continued to beat pots, honk horns, and wave handkerchiefs each day. The National Civic Crusade leaders also asked the Catholic Church to hold a special mass in support of the movement. When thousands gathered for the service, they were confronted by troops who were armed with automatic weapons and grenades. The troops tear-gassed the crowd and they fired off shots while helicopters were flying low over the church. This began the regime's self-declared state of siege. Now, in addition to the state of emergency and the siege, Noriega began targeting the prominent business leaders who headed the National Civic Crusade. Many of them found that their loans that they had secured from state banks were now being denied, their import licenses were being revoked, and they were being subjected to surprise visits from government inspectors. Some of their businesses were also being destroyed through arson and fire bombings. But direct repression proved to be an ineffective counter-strategy, so Noriega soon took took a new approach. He tried to create internal movement tensions. He did this by attempting to divide the movement along class lines, arguing that the movement leaders were wealthy professionals who were only seeking to advance their own material interests, and that he was the true champion of the poor. Additionally, he tried to exploit Panama's racial tensions by claiming that opposition organizers, who were largely white, held prejudicial views of black Panamanians. He also tried to undercut the movement's strength by claiming that the U.S. Embassy had organized the uprising in order to maintain control of Panama's canal. But none of these approaches worked because Panamanians from all races, classes, and ideological orientations wanted Noriega out. What did work for Noriega, however, was his strategy for keeping Panama's defense forces loyal. There had been numerous appeals for mutiny, but Noriega kept his troops loyal by allowing them to grow wealthy under his rule. He permitted officers to embezzle from government agencies, and he also allowed them to demand hefty bribes from Cubans who were traveling to Panama as a launching point for emigration to the United States. Officers routinely sold visas for $3,000 to $10,000 apiece. Another strategy that worked for Noriega was his response to international sanctions. In late 1987, the U.S. Congress eliminated millions of dollars in aid to Panama, and it pressured the World Bank to do the same. Panama's financial situation declined even further in 1988 when grand juries in Florida indicted Noriega on drug trafficking charges. And these indictments enabled the Reagan administration to freeze $300 million of Panamanian assets held in U.S. banks and to suspend another $115 million in tax payments from U.S. companies operating in Panama. By March of 1988, the U.S. had banned imports from and exports to Panama and froze Panamanian assets held in U.S. financial institutions. Within a couple weeks, Noriega was out of funds and unable to pay the 150,000 people on government payrolls, with the exception of his troops, who he always ensured received their paychecks. Now, to alleviate the nation's financial troubles, what Noriega did was he sought assistance from other countries. You could see the photo here on the right-hand side where he was giving a handshake to Fidel Castro. He sought out assistance from Cuba and Nicaragua, both of whom were ardently opposed to U.S. policies. The very first nation to provide help was Libya, and Libyan leader Gaddafi granted Noriega an emergency $24 million loan. Cuba also sent advisors to help with independent currency printing, and all of this assistance enabled Noriega's regime to stay afloat, albeit barely. The National Civic Crusade continued its protests throughout the summer and into the fall of 1989. However, the movement was never able to force Noriega out. He clung to power until late December 1989, when the U.S. sent troops into Panama. The Panama Defense Forces were defeated within hours, and a few days later, Noriega was flown to Miami, where he was prosecuted for drug trafficking and money laundering. Our third case is the Kenyan struggle against President Daniel Arap Moi. While Panama's National Civic Crusade was challenging Noriega, Kenyans were trying to oust their dictator. And when Moi was inaugurated in 1978, he found himself in a very precarious situation. He was an ethnic minority president, surrounded by politicians and military officers whose interests and ethnic loyalties differed from his own. Thus, Moi quickly began removing leaders who were part of the dominant ethnic Kikuyu group. He removed them from office and began replacing them with ethnic minorities. Moreover, he tightened his control over Kenya's security forces, and he restricted rights of assembly. By 1982, Moi had passed a constitutional amendment making his party the only legal political group. He also increased the use of repressive tactics, including torture. Some of the first acts of resistance to Moi came in 1985 when University of Nairobi students boycotted classes. When government officials ordered the students to return to the classroom, they refused, and instead several thousand gathered for demonstrations. The riot police broke up these events, arresting hundreds and killing one student in the process. As it became more difficult to organize on campuses, the only remaining free space was found in churches. Thus, Kenyan pastors soon became the most vocal government critics, using sermons to air their grievances. Very quickly, international journalists began attending services because they knew that this would be the place to get newsworthy information. And as they began reporting, this led to growing global scrutiny of political conditions in Kenya. In addition to these public denunciations, Kenyans also began to strike. Despite an official ban on strikes, more than 100 strikes involving 40,000 workers took place in 1986 and 1987. So how did Moi respond to the growing resistance? He escalated the use of repression. and his repressive ways drew attention from the international community and groups such as Amnesty International, which released a report documenting Kenya's poor human rights record. But Moi largely ignored these reports until 1991, when major donor nations suspended hundreds of millions of dollars in aid to Kenya, pending political and economic reforms. This was devastating to Moi, who had become heavily dependent on international aid. So he faced a choice. He could make political concessions or face a downward spiraling economy and mounting resistance. He decided that he was more likely to retain power if he kept the economy afloat, and thus he announced that multi-party elections would be held in 1992. As soon as other political parties were legalized, opposition leaders created the Forum for the Restoration of Democracy, also known as FORD. But Ford's chances for winning quickly evaporated as internal divisions emerged. Soon, the Forum for the Restoration of Democracy had two branches, Ford Kenya, which was a multi-ethnic coalition, and Ford Asilia, which was a predominantly Kikuyu group. Additionally, Kikuyu business leaders from the northern part of the country decided to form their own group, the Democratic Party. So as the opposition began organizing in this splintered fashion, Moi was developing his own strategy to win the election. First, he stirred up ethnic conflicts. In the first months of 1992, so-called tribal clashes exploded, leaving 1,500 people dead and over 300,000 people homeless. Moi's government refused to intervene, and in fact, evidence indicates that the regime actually supplied weapons and paid attackers. And as news of the clashes spread, Moi warned that the return of multi-party democracy would breed such vicious ethnic hostilities that the country would be destroyed by violence. Moi's second strategy was to pass muster with Kenya's donors by staging a C- election that would be reasonably clean on election day, but fraught with obstacles for the opposition in the period leading up to the balloting. Moi obstructed the opposition's pre-election efforts by denying requests for rally permits, and in some regions, Ford leaders were refused entry by district administrators, limiting their ability to reach voters in key areas. Moreover, Moi stacked the Electoral Commission in his favor, and this commission was highly criticized for its refusal to register over 1 million young voters and for turning a blind eye to opposition party harassment. Furthermore, it didn't permit groups such as the National Election Monitoring Unit to serve as election observers. And finally, opposition parties were not granted access to state-owned media until days before the election. Even party candidates were physically prevented from filing their nomination papers, which meant that there were a number of Moi-backed candidates that ran unopposed for parliament seats. Due to these strategies, Moi didn't need to resort to widespread fraud on election day. He'd done enough pre-election maneuvering to virtually guarantee his victory. Still, there were numerous voting irregularities and some eyewitness accounts of rigging and vote buying. But such bribes and rigging wasn't widely evident at the polling stations, where observers perceived people casting their ballot with few disturbances. So when the ballots were counted, no one was very surprised by the results. The opposition had won 2/3 of the popular vote, but those votes were divided among 3 parties, and thus Moi, who had won 1/3 of the vote, was returned to office. Numerous analysts blamed the opposition for their loss, arguing that they had succumbed to inter-ethnic rivalries, but others argued that even a united opposition stood little chance of winning, since Moi had stacked the odds so definitively in his favor. Because his fraudulent activities were subtle and mostly took place before Election Day, Moi was able to convince donors that the vote was fair enough to justify the restoration of aid. And while election observers acknowledged that there were some problems, the overall verdict was that Election Day procedures had earned the C- that Moi had aimed for, and thus most endorsed the results and reinstated aid. Moi then held on to the presidency until 2002, when he decided to retire. He had successfully clung to power for nearly a quarter century, and when he left office, it was on his own terms. He was never forced to step down. So what can we learn from the nonviolent uprisings in China, Panama, and Kenya? First, we can see that a good movement strategy that withdraws these multiple forms of citizen-based power is not enough to achieve one's goals. In all 3 of these nations, civil resistors were able to withhold authority, they withheld their cooperation, they challenged mentalities of obedience, they withdrew their skills through strikes, and they withdrew material resources. But still, they failed to overturn the regimes. In my opinion, the primary reason why these movements failed is because civil resistors were outmaneuvered by their opponents, and because internal movement problems made it difficult to launch a unified response. A closer look at the counter-strategies of the Chinese Communist Party, of Noriega and Moi, indicate that, in addition to the use of repression, these regimes had three main counter-strategies. First of all, they were attempting to divide the opposition. Second, they found ways to maintain troop loyalty. And third, they were effective at neutralizing international sanctions. Let me focus for a minute on how they divided the opposition. Both Noriega and Moi tried to generate tensions among civil resistors. Noriega attempted to create divisions within the National Civic Crusade by accusing its leaders of being racist and motivated by their own class interests. But given Noriega's reputation for dishonesty, most Panamanians did not find his allegations credible, and thus Noriega's effort yielded little results. Kenyan President Moi was more successful at dividing the opposition along ethnic lines. Both Panama and Kenya had long-standing ethnic tensions, so why was Moi successful at playing the ethnic card when Noriega was not? One answer is that Noriega had no evidence to back up his allegations of racism. Moi, however, had hired provocateurs to attack members of other ethnic groups, and these attacks left more than 1,000 dead and hundreds of thousands displaced. Thus, Moi's claims that the election of a Kikuyu leader could lead to ethnic conflict and to discrimination suddenly seemed highly plausible to many Kenyan minorities. Moreover, the sheer brutality involved in these orchestrated tribal clashes meant that the antagonism among rival ethnic groups was so intense that collaboration would be difficult. There's another reason why ethnic tensions divided Kenya's revolutionary struggle, but not Panama's. In Panama, people of all racial and ethnic backgrounds were suffering under Noriega's rule, and thus they were fairly unified in their desire to oust him. In contrast, many Kenyans opposed Moi because of his authoritarian repressive practices, but some ethnic minorities tolerated the dictator because they feared losing the gains their groups had made under Moi's rule, such as greater minority representation in the government and the military. Thus, ethnic minorities had something to lose if Moi were overthrown. But Panama's ethnic minorities had little to lose, since Noriega did not improve their social standing during his time in office. In short, Moi found a way to give minority groups a stake in his regime, which made them reluctant to join the opposition. Now, the second strategy about maintaining troop loyalty is evident in all three cases. Moi was able to accomplish this by filling officer ranks with ethnic minorities who felt that Moi, as a minority himself, was more likely to protect their tribe's interests than the mostly Kikuyu-led opposition parties. In other words, ethnic loyalties translated into regime loyalty. Noriega, however, had a more elaborate strategy for keeping his defense forces loyal. First, he reminded his troops that assaults on him were tantamount to assaults on the military institution as a whole, and few soldiers wanted to see the demise of a system that had made them so wealthy. Secondly, Noriega removed officers whose loyalty was questionable. He transferred them to overseas posts or forced them into early retirement. He also promoted those officers who pledged total support and loyalty. Third, Noriega's ruthless treatment of those who had turned against him may have deterred others from following suit. Specifically, a few officers had previously tried to overthrow Noriega, but their poorly planned rebellion was quickly defeated. And to discourage other attempts, Noriega imprisoned more than a dozen officers involved in the coup. They were given 20-year sentences and held in underground cells without lights or toilets. Now, the Chinese case reveals another strategy for sustaining the regime's sanctioning power. Evidence indicates that the Chinese Communist Party leaders were actually aware that their troops were becoming unreliable. They knew they couldn't count on them to carry out a violent crackdown. Thus, they brought in additional soldiers, by some accounts up to 300,000 additional soldiers, mostly from units outside the area. These new troops had not been subjected to protesters' appeals. Moreover, with tight control over the media, they were not aware of what had been transpiring in Tiananmen Square. There are even some reports that a sizable portion of the new troops came from Inner Mongolia, unless they didn't speak Mandarin, making them incapable of communicating with civil resistors. For all of these reasons, then, the new troops had little reason to question the legitimacy of orders they received to clear the square of protesters. These cases suggest that troops are most likely to remain loyal when they have something to lose. In Panama, few soldiers turned against Noriega because they had financial interests at stake. In Kenya, troops supported Moi because they feared ethnic retaliation or discrimination if he were deposed. However, if troops do not derive any direct benefits from the regime, they have little reason to protect it. Let me now focus on this third issue of neutralizing international sanctions. Several analysts have argued that economic sanctions are often ineffective precisely because political rulers can take actions to nullify their effects. And these actions can include finding new markets to counter the loss of trade, restructuring the domestic economy to be more self-reliant and less impacted by the sanctions, and relying on allied nations to provide needed imports and purchase exports despite the sanctions. The Panamanian and Kenyan cases reveal two additional strategies to counter the effects of international sanctions. In the Panama case, Noriega minimized the economic sanctions by soliciting aid from other nations, which kept Noriega solvent. He won over new allies by proclaiming that the sanctions against Panama were motivated by U.S. imperial interests in Latin America. The Nicaraguan, Cuban, and Libyan leaders didn't offer Noriega aid because they thought he was a morally respectable leader. Rather, they came to his aid because he had framed this as a battle against U.S. intervention. Consistent with the motto, "The enemy of your enemy is your friend," Noriega used sanctions to his benefit, winning new supporters through his willingness to confront the U.S. military superpower. Moi took a different approach to international sanctions. His strategy was to give the appearance of complying with donor demands so that aid would be restored, but without actually changing the system in any substantive way. He accomplished this through his C- election plan, and the brilliance of this plan was that Moi could create an uneven playing field well before the election, thereby eliminating the need for blatant acts of vote rigging and ballot tampering. Moreover, these activities were largely invisible to international observers who arrived just shortly before Election Day. Thus, when the international community declared that the election was fair enough, they not only restored aid, but they gave Moi new legitimacy as the so-called democratically elected leader of Kenya. So like Noriega, Moi was able to turn sanctions to his favor. But it's not only the counter-strategies that were important here. It was also the internal movement problems that these three cases faced. So what are the common types of problems that movements encounter? One is movement divisions and fragmentation over strategy. We can see this in China, where one faction was advocating negotiations and another faction wanted a strategy that was much more militant and confrontational. And thus the civil resistors ended up spending as much time battling each other, and that limited their ability to launch new actions. Of course, divisions can also arise from ethnic, class, and regional differences. In the Chinese case, students disdained the thousands of workers who came to the Tiananmen Square occupation. And rather than forming a coalition that would have broadened their base, the students largely ignored the workers. In addition, the Beijing students who initiated the movement found themselves fighting with students from outside provinces. And these tensions generated a high level of distrust, undermining the movement's ability to act collectively. A second factor that derailed these three uprisings was the inability to keep protesters nonviolent. In each case, there were moments when demonstrators turned hostile and aggressive. This gave the regime justification to declare martial law and to use repression. It may have also made soldiers reluctant to defect, fearing retaliation at the hands of a hostile crowd. So what can civil resistors do to prevent these problems? First of all, they can implement careful measures to maintain nonviolent discipline. What we see in successful nonviolent revolutions, such as the People Power movement in the Philippines or the East German case in 1989, is that these movement leaders trained resistors in the techniques of nonviolence. When individuals in the crowd became hostile, others were there to calm them down and to ensure that troops didn't use it as a justification for a repressive assault. We cannot expect people to naturally respond nonviolently. We have to train and prepare them to do so. Secondly, to avoid internal divisions, movement leaders can do a couple of things. They can emphasize the goal that unites them, namely ousting the existing regime. That doesn't mean that we should ignore differences, but rather emphasis should be placed on the first step, which is gaining a new political system. If there are differences in strategy, for example, one can actually switch tactics, shifting from confrontational tactics to negotiations. And you can actually pitch this as tactical variation, which is very effective because it often throws the opponent off, as the regime is unlikely to anticipate this shift. To avoid cross-class and regional conflicts, movements can emphasize that coalitions are needed to win. If the goal is regime change, then all ethnic, religious, class, and regional groups are needed to achieve this. And one solution may be to have groups operate autonomously. And we know actually from previous research that this is often a very good strategy because it makes it much more difficult for the regime to decimate a decentralized movement. But there still needs to be some kind of centralized communication network. To encourage security force defections, civil resistors need to find ways to increase the cost of regime loyalty. Since these cases reveal that troops are likely to remain loyal if they have some personal stake in the regime, civil resistors have to find other ways to increase the cost of loyalty. In other words, they can increase the incentives for defection and unreliability. There are a variety of mechanisms for achieving this. One is to raise political costs. In other movements, such as the Ukraine's Orange Revolution, civil resistors broadcast their actions on independent networks, and they warned troops that if they did in fact carry out orders and launched a bloody attack, it would be the leading headline on CNN and the British Broadcasting Network. This in turn may have led to international condemnation and the cutting of trade agreements and diplomatic ties. Civil resistors can also raise the honor costs of regime loyalty. They can emphasize to troops that they will be going down in history as supporters of a corrupt regime. Instead of being national heroes, they will be seen as those who oppressed their own citizens, who violently attacked unarmed people, who are demanding democracy and human rights. Finally, civil resistors need to be judicious about international involvement. In the Panama and Kenya cases, international actors who wanted to help civil resistors inadvertently undermined them. Policymakers and activists alike tend to assume that international support is unequivocally positive. But these cases reveal that international sanctions against a regime can potentially backfire in two ways. First, when a powerful nation, such as the United States, imposes sanctions on a dictatorship, those actions may actually create new allies for the regime. A second potential problem with international sanctions can be seen in the Kenyan case. After donor nations withdrew aid, Moi consented to donor demands, and this opened the opportunity to oust him, but that opportunity was lost when donor nations endorsed an unfair election. Kenyan citizens, not developed nations in northern hemispheres, should have decided whether to accept the elections, but since donors controlled the purse strings, they had undue influence. In short, international actors may gain inappropriate levels of power and influence when they intervene in a struggle, and they do not always use that power effectively. Does this mean that international support is always harmful to nonviolent revolutionary movements? Not necessarily, but one thing is clear. Whatever role international actors play in revolutionary situations, local civil resistors ought to have the greatest decision-making power in determining when, where, and how sanctions are applied. In conclusion, to be truly prepared for a nonviolent revolution, civil resistors need a savvy strategy, and they need to anticipate the regime's responses. In this webinar, I've drawn attention to some of the common counter-strategies that regimes use to retain power. I've highlighted some problems that can arise within movements and suggested ways to preemptively address them. However, I want to emphasize that there's no formula that guarantees success in all these cases. Even with careful planning, chance and contingency can add an element of unpredictability. Moreover, civil resistors may find it challenging to address some of these matters in a revolutionary environment where events and changes occur rapidly. Nonetheless, my hope is, in this presentation, that we can become more aware of key issues and challenges, and if civil resistors are prepared to address these matters, their chances for victory are greater. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Sharon, for your presentation. So this brings us to the next segment, which is the question and answer portion. We have a question from Adrian, and Adrian asks, why these cases and these cases only? Are they truly representative of the entire population of unsuccessful nonviolent movements?
No, they certainly aren't, and I don't mean to imply that these problems are generalizable to all movements. My whole purpose in doing this study was to at least start to chart out some of the common problems that movements face and to begin to look at what regimes do. We tend to think that regimes' only counter-strategy is repression, and while they do heavily depend on repression, they do many other things. So my purpose was to simply begin to chart out some of the common counter-strategies that regimes use, some of the common problems. I'm not implying that these are uniformly true for all movements. And in fact, my hope is what this does is inspire new researchers to go out and systematically test this in a more comprehensive basis using a wider array of cases. I'm sure there are other strategies that I didn't find here because with 3 failed cases, it's limited, but I do believe that this at least starts to chart out some new territory for us to explore through future research.
Okay, our next question is from Mengistu, who asks, how do we define failure? Should success be seen only in line with regime change in a specific time? How about some transformative achievements, such as the reintroduction of multi-party system which eventually led to the end of KANU's rule in 2002-2003.
Yeah, I've simplified what we mean by success and failure, and my definition of success was simply regime change, and that, of course, excludes many things. Sometimes you have regime change, but the new regime doesn't actually implement changes that transform the society. So can we call that a success? Some people have raised that question, for example, about the 1986 Philippine People Power movement. Yes, the dictator was ousted, a new democratically elected leader was in, but she failed to make a lot of wide-scale changes. So in some ways, my definition of success is very limited. I did that intentionally, however, because I think the processes of setting up a new regime are different than the processes of ousting an old one. The same is true with my definition of failure. This isn't a total failure. For example, in Kenya, it did force multi-party elections to happen. It wasn't a completely open and democratic system and a process as we would hope it to be, but it did force the beginning of multi-party elections. It did force the president to legalize other political parties. In that sense, there were gains made, and I don't mean to say that these were totally abysmal failures. In no way. I think the resistance was important, and just by bringing the challenges, it forced the president to make certain concessions. So it's a very simplified definition of success and failure that really isn't fair in the sense that it doesn't acknowledge those gains. And of course, what it did is it set the stage for later challenges, but it didn't achieve the goal of ousting the dictatorship. So in that sense, it's not a completely comprehensively accurate picture, but I was focusing specifically on regime change and ousting of authoritarian leaders.
Okay, our next question is from Lester. Lester, please go ahead.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi, Les.
Hi. This was absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much, Sharon. Great presentation with a lot of stuff to think about and work on. One of the things I liked was your looking at the international level and its importance in terms of sanctions and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And actually following up on the question of success and failure and how it's defined, I've often found it interesting how the Tiananmen Square massacre, it seems to me, actually helped to set the stage for the 1989 revolutions in the fall in Eastern Europe. And I think that Gorbachev was actually very embarrassed by the Tiananmen massacre,
Mm-hmm.
and so that it backfired not in China, but in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union.
Yeah, it's very difficult to find empirical evidence to measure what was the influence of the Tiananmen Square struggle on the later revolutions of 1989. And of course, it would be nice if we could interview Gorbachev and ask him about this. There is some evidence, for example, in the East German case, that East German leaders invited the Chinese Communist Party leadership to come and actually teach them how to stop this revolt. They said, you were successful in stopping it. What should we do to handle this revolution? And I think the key in that case in East Germany was the fact that Gorbachev had said, due to our own economic problems, we can no longer intervene in the affairs, the domestic affairs of our fraternal nations in Eastern Europe. So on one hand, maybe Gorbachev, in fact, did learn a lesson from that, but the East German government was trying to crack down as their Chinese counterparts had done. They just weren't very successful in doing it, primarily, in my assessment, because the troops in East Germany were not willing to carry out orders. And I think some of that has to do with the fact that the troops in East Germany were recruits for the most part. These were people who were not career officers, who had just been drafted out of the population to serve their mandatory military service and didn't want to crack down on their friends and their family members who had gathered. Moreover, they identified themselves primarily as civilians who shared the same concerns. So we do know definitely that some of the leaders and some of the regime figures were talking at this time in 1989 about how to stop these kind of civilian uprisings, but some of them were successful in doing it and some were not. And I think there's a number of factors involved. Certainly Gorbachev's influence in East Germany was much stronger than it was in China, where those tensions had kind of existed between the Soviet Union and China for some time. But on the other hand, we also know that people are constantly learning, and civil resistors benefit when they can kind of learn from other struggles, not only successful ones, but I think the failed ones as well.
Right. Great. Thank you.
Our next question is from Ahmed. Please go ahead.
Hi there. This is Ahmed from Bangkok.
Yes.
So, I I'm a peace activist. I use media, film. The only problem is that when regime control all the technologies like internet to smuggle out all this information, even videos, or even like tweeting, and at the same time they lobby with their international allies to look like really they are doing good. So how to integrate the activists or leaders and how to find a way out to carry the mission? That's a big question.
Oh, I wish I had a really good answer for that, because that is a big question, and that clearly is really important. And that was one of the problems in the Tiananmen Square struggle, is that the state-controlled media meant it was really difficult for civil resistors to even know what was going on there in Beijing, but also to coordinate from the rest of the country. I think you see in other places that there's a lot more independent media that is then transmitting this information that puts pressure on the state. As I mentioned, the Ukraine's Orange Revolution, there were independent media groups that were monitoring this, and therefore any crackdown that would have occurred would have, in fact, evoked a lot of political response from the international community. It's much more difficult when there aren't those independent media sources, when the state has a very tight control over the media. I'm no technology expert, that's clear, but I think what we could see in the Arab Spring uprisings is there are alternative forms of media. Even when the state stopped the internet in Egypt, even when there was a temporary blockage of tweeting and cell phone use, somehow they still managed to keep getting the word out. I think it would be great if we had media experts studying this and trying to find ways for civil resistors who might find themselves in contexts where state-controlled media is difficult to break through, to give them other opportunities and other means of sending this information out. That is a critical piece of it. Certainly, technology was different back in the 1980s when my cases were taking place, but I think that is an ongoing struggle. Even with our new forms of technology, there has to be more systematic study to understand how civil resistors can link to the global community through alternative media sources.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, our next question is from Jim. Please go ahead, Jim.
Hi. Mine was kind of a question, comment. I think it would be a good idea for the Occupy movement in the United States to spend more time talking about strategizing about police response to their behaviors. And I think there is a strategic point to work on, and that is that the Occupy movement is concerned with the future viability of police pensions, along with everybody's pensions. And I don't think that's been talked about enough, and there hasn't been enough energy working on alliances. Any comments?
Yeah, I agree with you completely. And in fact, right now I'm doing an article where I'm trying to understand a little bit more where these alliances between police and security forces, the troops, and resistors can be built. And I think too often people have viewed them as kind of opposites, as antagonists to one another. But what we see in some critical cases, like the Orange Revolution, people did that. They reached out to the military, they reached out to police officers, they convinced them that in a new regime, new leaders would address their poor pensions, their low pay, their poor living conditions. I think this is a critical piece. If you've seen Eric Chenoweth's and Maria Stephan's book, they emphasize this as well, that security force defections are really important, and if you can get the police and the troops to side with the movement, your chances of winning are much greater. We know very little about this. This is kind of a new area of research. And I think for those police officers, they're kind of making these calculations. And so what civil resistors have to do is think about what will win them over to our side. How do we persuade them of this? And we don't have a lot of information about it yet. But I think you're absolutely right that there's got to be ways where movements can start to reach out to police. It's difficult to do, especially if the police have been repressive. It's hard to overcome that tension or that animosity. But it seems to be a critical element of these types of struggles.
I saw something this morning that surprised me along that lines. I was at a cafe, and a countercultural couple brought their 3-year-old girl who really wanted to speak to the group of cops sitting at a table and introduce herself over to them. And I thought for those cops, that it must be nice to have a pension, it must be nice to have pay, but to feel like the community appreciates what you do is an asset that could be lost. And the appearance of this couple was unlikely, so it surprised me.
Yeah, I'm hoping that future researchers are going to give us a lot more insight into this and that movements can learn from it.
All right, thank you. I actually had a quick question. It seems between the three cases you presented, one of the commonalities that keeps people and security forces loyal to the incumbent regime is a fear of loss, whether it's a fear by minorities to lose gains they've made or by troops losing their jobs. But on the flip side of this, and you kind of touched upon this in your conclusion, how do you think movements can really do a better job in emphasizing or vocalizing the gains that can be achieved if they're successful?
I think this is a reflection of multiple forces. Civil resistors can do things to persuade troops to side with them. The regime, of course, as I talked about, is also doing things to try and keep their troops loyal. And I also think there are certain structural factors that make a difference here. I'm thinking about, for example, the recent movement in Egypt. And of course, the military did side with the civil resistors. And as I began looking into why that was the case, again, they had some economic incentives not to stay loyal to the regime, but to actually side with the civil resistors. And that was because Hosni Mubarak was planning to basically bring his son into power when he resigned. And his son had plans to privatize a lot of industries that the military controlled. So the military there wasn't just about a defense force. They actually owned a number of industries and a lot of real estate. And they saw this as a structural issue where new political leader was going to result in economic losses for the military institution. So what you have there is kind of a structural system where the military is also an economic force. So I think this is a really complicated thing that most of us haven't explored yet. Yes, there's kind of a rational calculation going on in the minds of troops. Do we side with the regime? What are the benefits of doing so? What are potential losses if we side with civil resistors? Of course, if they're fearful of their lives, they're unlikely to defect. But it's not only about what civil resistors can do in terms of offering incentives for defection. There are things they can do. It's also about what the regime's doing and some of the structural conditions, the type of military that's in place, the proportion of recruits or professional military officers. I think civil resistors have to kind of look at the whole picture and figure out where strategically they have the best chance. To simply kind of make appeals to honor costs or political costs isn't enough. There has to be kind of an assessment of the overall situation and the real incentives that troops have one way or another to side with the regime or to defect. I mean, there are some simple things that civil resistors can do. I think of the Iranian Revolution in 1979, where the movement made it easier for troops to defect. And one of the things they would do is if a soldier wanted to defect, they would get them civilian clothes and give them money to go back to their families. So they facilitated defections by simply making it easier to do. But I think it's a much more complicated situation where civil resistors really have to think about what do they have at stake? Why might they stay loyal to the regime even if they don't believe that the regime is a just or good one? And it is complicated. It's about the incentives and the deterrence from both the regime, from the civil resistors, and a reflection of the structural conditions.
Thank you. Next up is Mohammed. Please go ahead with your question.
Hi, how are you?
Good.
Yeah, thank you for your lecture. It was really good. Just a question that you mentioned now what was going on in Egypt in the Egyptian revolution. What about the Syrian case? I mean, like, yeah, the problem of the defection in Syria is really tough. It means really complicated. What do you think about that?
It is complicated, and one of the things that I think is going on in Syria is, again, not an ethnic but a sectarian issue. So a lot of the military officers are from kind of a minority group, but one that is privileged, right? That has a lot of advantages in society, whereas a lot of the recruits are Sunnis. And so what you see happening is a lot of the recruits do not want to attack a population that they share an identity with, but the officers are staying loyal. So this whole issue of defection in Egypt, the military as an institution shifted its allegiance away from the regime to the movement, but in Syria you have individuals deciding to either stay loyal or defect, and it's splitting. It's basically splitting along sectarian lines, and that then can lead to civil war, which it looks like Syria is on the brink of, or perhaps already is in the midst of. So there are different ways that defections can occur, but I think this ethnic or sectarian piece has to be examined very closely, because not all troops in Syria have ethnic advantages with the current regime, and therefore some are splitting, but some who do have the benefits are staying loyal. And when they split and they form a separate armed group, that's a recipe for civil war, two armed groups fighting each other. So it isn't, I think this is a very complicated issue, and we have to look at all the factors, but it seems to me that the sectarian issue there is what's really critical. That wasn't present in the same way in the Egyptian situation.
Thank you.
All right, thanks. So the next question, I'll combine two people who wrote in separate questions about violence. And the first question comes from Dan, who asks, looking at the case of South Africa under apartheid as an example, do you think resistance movements that are nonviolent could benefit potentially from the introduction of elements of violence? And to go along with that, wouldn't factions and security forces, this comes from Matthew, can these be considered a source of insecurity that actually fuels violence and civil resistance?
Can you repeat that second one again?
Sure. Would defections and security forces, can they be a source of insecurity that actually fuels violence and civil resistance?
Yeah. So let me address the first one, which we often refer to as the radical flank effect. What happens when you have both an armed struggle and simultaneously a nonviolent civil resistance struggle? Does the civil resistance movement benefit when there's an armed threat there? There's mixed evidence on that, and I think we're still trying to research this question and understand it more thoroughly. We do know that that happens. I mean, we can even see this in the United States history of the civil rights movement, that King often was seen as the more preferable civil rights leader to negotiate with because he was less of a threat, less of a menace than Malcolm X, who was advocating a more militant and potentially violent response. So some people have argued King gained certain status or influence because Malcolm X played a different role. Does that play out in these struggles? There's mixed. I think there's mixed results there. I certainly don't know the literature comprehensively enough to address it, but that does play a factor. And I think what happens is international groups are much more likely to support civil resistance. Many nonprofit groups are reluctant to back armed struggles, and therefore it can benefit a civil resistance struggle in that regard, that they're more likely to get international support than their armed counterparts. But it's unclear exactly when and under what circumstances that benefits them or potentially hurts them. In terms of defections being a security matter, certainly it's unclear how that's going to play out. As I mentioned, in Egypt, when the military sided, it was a tremendous advantage for the movement. But in Syria, as the military splitting, with officers remaining loyal to the Syrian regime and a lot of recruits defecting and some of them actually picking up arms, yes, that creates a whole new dynamic in which civil war is a possibility. Yet I think civil resistors still need to pay attention to this because the military plays an important role one way or another. It is dangerous to encourage defections in the sense that it could promote civil war, but it is also dangerous when troops remain loyal and carry out orders to repress. So it's something that civil resistors need to take very seriously and strategize about how can we encourage defections and maintain the nonviolent character of the movement. What this indicates to me is there's a lot of research that still needs to be done and we have a lot to learn, but we're starting to see some of the key factors that matter, and security force defections are important one way or another.
All right, thank you, Sharon. And on that note, I think we'll start to wrap it up. Unfortunately, we're out of time. Are there any closing remarks or sort of conclusions you'd like to draw before we finish?
No, I just would like to emphasize again that I don't mean to imply that these are failed cases. My purpose here is really to look at some of the problems that arise so that civil resistors can be more informed. We're not doing ourselves a favor when we only look at what the movement should do and what the strategy of the movement is. We need to also look at what the other side does. That makes civil resistors better informed and better capable of winning their goals and promoting democracy. So I thank you all for the opportunity to present my research, and thank you for the questions. It's been very thought-provoking and hopefully will inspire me to continue with the research in this area. Thank you very much.
Thanks. And as you mentioned, thanks to all the listeners for all your questions. And I noticed there were a lot of comments and questions still left, so sorry we couldn't get to all of them. You can, however, send an email to us at webinar@nonviolent-conflict.org, and we'll forward it to Dr. Nepstad for you. And as a reminder, this webinar has been recorded and will be uploaded to our website in the next couple days. So if you joined us late, or if you have someone who was unable to attend and might be interested, you can forward it to them once it's uploaded. And our website again is www.nonviolent-conflict.org. And we'll also be sure to upload any resources or any other articles that Dr. Nepstad mentioned. And feel free to come find us on Facebook or Twitter. We're at NVConflict. And again, thanks everyone for joining us. Be sure to keep an eye out for our upcoming webinars. And Dr. Nepstad, thank you so much for your presentation.
Thank you.